Hi everyone, welcome back to PolyCloud YouTube channel, your one-stop destination to learn cloud from scratch to certification. In this brand new series, we are going to deep dive into complete Microsoft Azure administration, that is AZ-104 exam syllabus, step by step, concept by concept, with the real world example, live demo and hands-on labs. Whether you are preparing for certification, starting a cloud career, or just wanted to strengthen your Azure skill, this series will help you gain the knowledge and confidence to ace the exam. We will cover everything from managing Azure identities, subscription, and storage to virtual machine networking and monitoring, exactly as per the official AZ-104 syllabus or the objective. So make sure you have subscribed to our PolyCloud YouTube channel and hit that bell icon so you will get notified whenever a new video is uploaded. So let's start our journey to become a Microsoft certified Azure administrator. So today in this video we are going to cover a first topic, that is managing Microsoft Entra ID. And so there will be three videos under this topic, from which today in this video we are going to see Microsoft Entra ID and Entra ID users and Entra ID Connect.
Tenant. So I've signed into the portal here with an account that has an Azure Entra ID tenant called Azure DevOps. And it does have a subscription tied to it, because here in the portal, if I search for the word sub to go to subscriptions, for my Azure DevOps tenant, I have a valid pay-as-you-go subscription. That's good because it will allow me to create resources. And when you create resources, you specify the resource group where they should be created, in addition to other things like the geographical region. In the left-hand navigator here in the portal, we have a resource groups view. If I click on that view, any existing resource groups will be shown here. Now, depending on which service you're deploying in Azure, sometimes it might make a resource group, such as if you're working with things like Azure Site Recovery, ASR. However, at any point in time, you can create your own resource group. If I were, for example, to click on an existing resource group, here I've got one called HQ for headquarters. If I click on it to open it up, when overview is selected over on the right, any resources that were deployed into that resource group will be shown here. Now, if you delete the resource group, you would also be deleting all of the resources deployed in it. You can also click Access Control IAM on the left and add role assignments, basically to delegate administrative access to resources in this resource group, such as Reader. Filter the list for the word virtual, maybe the virtual machine administrator login or the virtual machine contributor role, which allows for the management of virtual machines. In this case, it would only be in the HQ resource group. So the point is that we can delegate permissions. Also, if I scroll down on the left, I can click Cost Analysis. And what it's doing is taking a look at all of the resources deployed only in this resource group and showing me associated costs. So sometimes you might deploy a resource group for departments within the organization, maybe for various projects, production versus testing environments. Whatever the case is, that you might want to organize resources, even for a web app. If I've got a web app called Web App 1, I might want to deploy all of the resources for that into its own resource group. That way it's a little bit easier to manage, to navigate to, and also to track costs for. Let's go back to the resource group's main view, and let's create a new one. I'm going to choose Create. I'm going to call it Web App 1. And I'll deploy that in the East US region. Notice, of course, I can add up to 50 name and value pairs or tags for this. For example, maybe I'll use the environment name, that's a tag, with the value of development testing, because maybe that's what Web App 1 will be used for. If I click Next, Review, Create, the validation has passed, so I can go ahead and choose Create the Web App 1 resource group, and here it is. Notice that the tags are showing up here in the list of resource groups. So now, if I were to deploy something new in my subscription, I'll click Create a Resource. Let's say I'm deploying a virtual machine. One of the first things I have to contend with is the resource group where I want to deploy this type of resource. Now, we can create a new resource group at the time that we're deploying, in this case, a virtual machine, or we can simply choose it from the list, like Web App 1. But this isn't limited only to when you're deploying virtual machines, of course. If I close out of this and just choose OK, I don't want to create that. If I were to deploy a web application, once again, I can choose to create a new resource group or deploy it into an existing one. Let's close out of that with the X. Let's say I want to create a new storage account. So type in storage account. I'll select storage account from Microsoft, and I'll click Create. Well, in the exact same manner, we can either create a resource group or we can select it from the list. Now, once you've deployed resources into resource groups, we know that you can track the costs for them, but we also know that if you delete the resource group, you're deleting everything in it. But additionally, when we go to the properties of a resource group, we can also select a resource deployed in the resource group, and at the top here, if we click the More button, it looks like 3 dots. We can choose to move it to another resource group, to another subscription, or to another region. Currently, that storage account is in East US. If I were to choose move to another resource group, we would specify the target, let's say web app 1, choose next, and it's checking whether these resources can be moved. That can take a few minutes. Okay, once it's ready to move, the next button becomes available. I would just click next, turn on the check mark that states I understand that any references to the old ID will now change because an object ID for an Azure resource includes the resource group it's in. Okay, and then I'll click the move button. In the upper right, if I click the bell notification icon, it now tells me that moving the resource has completed. So that was called Store Account HQ2. If we go to our storage accounts view here in the portal and open up Store Account HQ2 in the overview page, among other locations, notice that for the resource group, it now shows as being part of the Web App 1 resource group. Over on the right, if I click JSON view, notice that the object ID here includes the subscription, but as well the resource group that this storage account in this case was deployed to. And that's why we got that message when we were moving that said, I understand that any scripts or any code that might have referenced the old resource ID will no longer work because the resource ID has changed to include the new resource group it was moved into. The Azure CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface. It allows us to manage our Azure services from the command line. Now, there are many ways that you can access the CLI, including getting to it through the Azure portal. For instance, here in the Azure portal, if I hover over the icon to the right of the search bar with the search field at the top, it pops up and says Cloud Shell. You can launch Cloud Shell in Azure, which is a way that you can have access to command line utilities like the Azure CLI. If you've done this for the first time, it won't have any storage mounted. And this is important because when you're in a command line environment, if you work on files, you might want them to persist between Cloud Shell sessions. So I'll accept the defaults for it to create a storage account. I'll click the Create Storage button. This won't happen in future invocations of Cloud Shell through the portal. Once it initializes, Cloud Shell looks like this. I'm just going to go ahead and maximize this screen. So we're in Cloud Shell, specifically in the upper left, we're in Bash. So if I type AZ space version, it returns back the version of the Azure CLI running here in Cloud Shell, which is 2.56.0. Now, being in a Bash environment, Bash stands for Born Again Shell. If you're into Linux, you're going to be familiar with this shell environment. It allows you to use common commands you might be used to in Linux, including how to handle things like memory variables. But if I switch over from Bash to PowerShell, and I'll confirm that switch, this would allow people familiar and comfortable with PowerShell to use PowerShell commandlets to manage Azure Cloud Services from the command line. But this is not about PowerShell right now. We'll talk about that later. The point is this. I can still run CLI commands here in PowerShell, AZ version. When you use the Azure CLI, all commands are prefixed with the AZ term. So you don't have to install anything anywhere if you want to run the Azure CLI through the portal, or rather through Cloud Shell, to be more specific. However, back here in my web browser, you might want to run it on your local computer and not have to do it through the Azure portal. So it doesn't take long to find, if you search in your browser for Azure CLI, how to get to the installation options, whether you're installing on the Windows platform, Mac OS, or various distributions of Linux. Or perhaps you want to run the CLI within a Docker container. We already know we can run it in Cloud Shell. I'm going to click Install on Windows. So I'm going to scroll down to get the latest MSI, the Microsoft installer file of the Azure CLI 64-bit. Once that's been downloaded, I'm going to go ahead and click on it to run it. It says that the app isn't a Microsoft verified app. I'll just click Install anyway. I'll accept the terms in the license agreement. I will click the Install button, continue through the installation wizard. Okay, and then for too long, the CLI setup will be completed, so I'll click Finish. So here on the computer where I performed the installation, I've simply opened up a Windows command prompt from the start menu. I'll just type AZ version to see what we get. Okay, it knows what we're talking about. And in fact, we have version 2.57.0 here. Taking note of the version of the CLI can be important sometimes if you're looking at code examples or looking through help documentation online, as some changes do occur over time with the CLI. Commands change, parameters change, and so on. Now, one of the first things you would do in the CLI is authenticate to your Azure account from the command line. And we can do that here using AZ space configure. You wouldn't have to do this in Cloud Shell because Cloud Shell is spawned from an authenticated session to the Azure portal already. Okay, so it specifies where the settings file is. It shows the cloud I'm connecting to, which is the Azure cloud. That would be as opposed to something like the Azure government cloud. First run is set to yes. Do you wish to change your settings? No, so N for no. And now to actually do the login, I'll run AZ login. What that's going to do is open up a web browser session on my local machine where I'll be asked to authenticate with my Azure account. So I've done that. I've specified the credentials, and it says you have logged into Microsoft Azure. You can close this window. Okay, let's close the window. Let's go back to the command prompt. Okay, I'm signed in. Now it does list all of the Microsoft Entra ID tenants here. It says the following tenants don't contain accessible subscriptions. We know that you need a subscription tied to a tenant so that when you switch to that tenant, you can create Azure resources like virtual machines and all that stuff. Then it says the following tenants require multi-factor authentication, or MFA. That can be configured, such as Azure DevOps. And if you want to log into a specific tenant, you can use AZ login -- tenant and then specify the tenant ID. For example, Azure DevOps is shown here. I'm going to copy its ID, and I'll run the AZ login command with the -- tenant parameter. And for the value, I'll just paste in my Entra ID tenant. And again, I get the "you have logged into Microsoft Azure" message. So I've logged into a specific tenant. You can do that if you have multiple tenants. Otherwise, you don't have to do that. You can just use AZ login. So when I log directly into the tenant, notice the output is different. It's showing me that I have a pay-as-you-go subscription, my tenant ID, everything is good. So we are in. So if I were to issue commands like AZ-AD, that's Azure Active Directory, although of course it's really called Entra ID now, but at any rate, if I run user and then space list, it lists all of the user accounts that are available here in my current Entra ID tenant. And to make that output a little more palatable, instead of seeing all of those properties, I'll just use the up arrow key to bring up that previous command. But at the end, what I'm going to do is add -- query space open close square bracket dot display name. Notice that the word display is lowercase and name has initial caps, capital N. The open and close square bracket simply reference that it's a collection. It's an array of similar items. In this case, a collection of users in Azure AD or Entra ID. And we're just calling upon the dot display name property for each object of that type. So if I press enter, all we get now are the display names. So we now have a sense of how we can access and, of course, install the Azure CLI on a local machine running Windows. Hey, in this demo, I will be installing Azure PowerShell on Windows. Now I'm going to be installing this on an on-premises computer. Just like with the Azure CLI, another option is to run PowerShell commandlets directly through Cloud Shell. So for example, here I've signed into the Azure portal, so I'm already authenticated. If I click the Cloud Shell icon, that's the first icon to the right of the search field at the top of the portal. When I click that, it'll spawn Cloud Shell. If it's the first time you've run it, you'll be asked to set up storage and a storage account for persistent storage of files that you might refer to when you're working in Cloud Shell. Here, I'm automatically placed in Bash, where I can run CLI commands. For example, the CLI commands, it always begins with AZ, so if I enter AZ version, for instance, it returns back some version details about CLI components. But what I can do is switch from Bash to PowerShell, and I'll click Confirm. And so now I've got a command prompt where PowerShell is already available in terms of the Azure modules. So for instance, if I were to run get-az subscription to return details about my current subscription, it returns back that it's called pay-as-you-go. I have the subscription ID. I don't have to authenticate because I'm already authenticated by being in the portal in the first place. However, as was the case when we talked about the CLI, you might choose to have the PowerShell modules that contain the commandlet definitions for Azure available locally on your computer. So you don't have to go in through the portal. You can just run them locally. And using command line tools like the CLI and PowerShell can be very useful, especially as you get more and more used to the Azure cloud computing environment. It can sometimes be quicker to type in commands and certainly to put commands and scripts and run those scripts, maybe to provision resources, to get statistics about resources out there, whatever the case might be. Okay, so I've searched up install Azure PowerShell, and it's pretty easy to find this in the Microsoft Azure documentation online. Now, for installation methods, we can choose PowerShell Gallery. And what that means is that we can go into PowerShell on our Windows computer, and we can basically reach out to the internet and say, hey, let's install the Azure modules that we need. Or you could run the MSI installer. So if I do the PowerShell Gallery method, it starts talking about what we need to do to get this installed, such as install-module, that's the name of a PowerShell module that you would run on premises. Dash name is AZ for Azure, of course. Dash repository is the PowerShell Gallery, PS Gallery. I'm going to go ahead and copy that command. And here on my local computer, I've opened up a PowerShell command prompt, PS. I'm going to run install-module, -name AZ, -repository, PS Gallery, and -force to force the installation to occur. This means if we've already got some Azure module data installed on this machine, we're going to overwrite it. Once that's done, I can run get-command. Let's say we're looking for commandlets that have the word get at the beginning, asterisk for wildcard number of characters. Let's say AZAD, wildcard. So we've got a lot of Azure Active Directory, which we know, of course, is referred to as Entra ID now. But we've got a lot of commandlets that include that in the name of the commandlet, such as get-az AD group member, get-az AD user. We can then run connect-az account to authenticate to Azure. Of course, that's going to pop up a web browser window where I can authenticate with my Azure credentials, after which it'll say authentication complete. If we go back into PowerShell, it will return back some details about who we logged in with, the name of our Azure subscription, the ID of the default tenant. So we should be able to issue commandlets such as get-az AD user. Enter. That'll return any user accounts that we have within the current selected or active Entra ID tenant, shown up above with the tenant ID. Of course, we could run many other types of commandlets to deploy resources, to manage resources, to get statistics about what we've deployed in the Azure cloud, and so on. In this demonstration, I'm going to deploy a Microsoft Entra Domain Services configuration. Now, what is this? Essentially, you could say that Entra Domain Services is a cloud-hosted solution to run Active Directory in the Azure cloud. But the great thing about it is you don't have to manually provision the virtual machines for domain controllers. You don't have to install the Active Directory Domain Services feature. You also don't have to worry about patching the OS. All of that is handled under the hood for you by Microsoft. And that's why we would call this a managed service. So what happens here is we would deploy our Entra Domain Services, which is associated then with our Entra ID tenant. Setting up Entra Domain Services creates separate VNet, a virtual network, subnet, and it will synchronize all of the users from our Entra ID tenant. And of course, because it's really full-fledged Active Directory, it supports things that we're commonly used to, like joining devices to the domain and partaking in group policy. As an Azure administrator, we need to at least be aware that this is an option. While you can do a lot with it, we're essentially just going to provision Entra Domain Services. So let's get started here. When you want to do this, what you need to do is you need to navigate in your web browser to entra.microsoft.com. That gives you this Microsoft Entra Admin Center. You can do a lot of stuff here, but the only thing that we are interested in is working with domain services. Now notice it takes my existing signing credentials for my Azure account and my Entra ID tenant, which in this case is called Azure DevOps. So I'm going to search for domain services up in the search field at the top, and there it is, Microsoft Entra Domain Services. I'm going to go ahead and go into that option. Any existing configurations will be shown here. Of course, I don't have any yet, so I would simply click the Create button. Now, I would do this because I want to have what is essentially a full-fledged version of Microsoft Active Directory, but hosted in the Azure cloud. Because remember, your Entra ID tenant unto itself doesn't support all Active Directory features, including things like group policy, where this would. Okay, so I have to tie this to a subscription and deploy it into a resource group. If I'm going to be using Entra Domain Services to help support a web app, perhaps, for example, I'll deploy this configuration in the Web App 1 resource group. Of course, I could also click Create New to create a new resource group. We can also specify a DNS domain name, as that's what's required for Active Directory. So maybe in this example, I'll specify quick24x7.info. I can specify the region where I want this deployed. East US is fine. For the SKU, I'm going to make sure this is just set to standard. Selecting a different option for the SKU really controls the level of performance you can expect from this deployment, and also how often backups are taken. I'm not concerned with those options here, as this is just a test deployment, so I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Now, I don't have to change anything here. It's going to create a virtual network called AADDS-VNet and a subnet. I'll click Next. I'll accept that. I'm not going to change anything under Administration. For synchronization, it's going to synchronize all of our Entra ID accounts into this domain. Not going to change anything there. I'm not going to change any of the security settings, and I'll click Next. And I'm not going to click anything for tags, so I'm just going to go ahead and let it validate. And once that's been done, I can review my choices here. I'm okay with them. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. Now it says you should know that some of these choices are final. You can't change them after the fact, like the DNS name, the subscription or resource group association, the virtual network subnet. Okay, I'll click the OK button. Okay, so the deployment is currently in progress. Now don't sit around and stare at this and wait for it. In some cases, it could take up to an hour for this to be fully deployed. Now, maybe it's a good time to go get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or to work on other admin tasks. We'll come back here in a little while and we'll check on it. Okay, so now our domain services deployment has completed successfully. It says your deployment is complete, and we can click on the Go to Resource button to open details about our configuration. And we can also switch back to the Azure portal and go to the All Resources view, where if I scroll down for the type where it says Microsoft Entra Domain Services, we've got our custom domain name shown here, quick24x7.info. So we can also click here to open its properties, which is the same thing we were looking at a moment ago. If I click synchronization on the left, these are the options we had when we were deploying it initially, where we can determine if we want to synchronize all users and groups from our Entra ID tenant. In the left-hand navigator here in the portal, if I go to virtual networks, of course, we know that it created a VNet, and within that, a subnet to host the underlying virtual machines. And if we go to the virtual machines view over on the left, we don't see any because we can't manage them. When you deploy your own virtual machines manually, they show up here. You're responsible for configuring and patching them. But that's not the case here with a managed platform like Entra Domain Services. But back to our virtual networks view on the left, and we'll focus on VNets later. But for now, if I go into the properties of a different VNet, where perhaps I've got virtual machines that I want to be able to join to my domain services domain, that means they need to be able to find domain controllers using DNS. Well, back in my Entra Domain Services configuration, if I go into the properties on the left, we've got two IP addresses here. One's for LDAP external IP, and we've got a private internal IP, where when we go to our VNets properties, we can go to the DNS server item on the left, and we can specify custom DNS server IPs, in this case to point to our Active Directory domain deployment. So in this course, we've examined Azure Entra ID, and we've installed the CLI and PowerShell module. We did this by exploring Microsoft Entra ID, subscriptions, and tenants. We navigated through Microsoft Entra ID, and we created a Microsoft Entra ID tenant. We then enabled an Entra ID custom DNS domain name. We managed administrative units. We also configured management groups and managed applications. Next, we created resource groups, installed the Microsoft Azure CLI, as well as the Azure PowerShell module, and we deployed Microsoft Entra Domain Services. In our next course, we'll move on to explore how to manage Entra ID users, as well as how to manage Entra Connect Sync.